Welcome to the First Presbyterian Church of Englewood, a community committed to live boldly, share boundlessly, grow community, and build God's world. Please visit us in person or at englewoodpres.org.
Well, friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly, for the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." Well, we are in the second week of the series called How to Be Happy, and I just wanted to recap very quickly. Last week we were talking about attitudes that people bring, and we were talking about the fact that Jesus was confronted with crowds who were grumbling because he was welcoming sinners and welcoming tax collectors, people whom they did not like and did not believe deserved to be in Jesus' presence. And so we were talking about the idea that unmerited favor can seem unfair and it can make people grumble, but really we should see unmerited favor as a blessing, okay? We should see unmerited favor as something that is good that is happening because it helps us see the world as a place where unmerited favor happens. And that helps our attitude toward looking at how the world functions, that if we understand that the world is a place of unmerited grace, that's actually a good thing because it's good for us, because we are the recipients of unmerited grace, unmerited blessing from God. And so it's a lot of it is in how you choose to look at it. Is it unfair, or is it actually a positive thing that we live in a world where God blesses us with unmerited favor? So this week I want to start with a question as we're on week 2, and that's simply this. Are you prepared for your future? And when I ask that question, I want you to think about the idea of what comes to mind when you ask that. You know, when someone says, "Are you prepared for your future?" I think a lot of us are like, well, at least at my age, did I go to ssa.gov and check my Social Security credits? Or stuff like that. I think a lot of people think of that in terms of money, in terms of savings. In fact, I remember I used to see this commercial from a financial firm that talked about retirement planning, and it would show these people walking around with a big number under their arms, right? I don't know if you saw that commercial. They walked around with a big number under their arms, like that person on the right is carrying 1,989,203, and supposedly that was his number. That was the amount of resources he needed to have in order to be able to comfortably retire. It was thinking about your future and whether you were ready boiled down to a number. But I don't think that that's what God has in mind in terms of whether or not we're prepared for the future. So this week I think he's pointing us to something else. And we're in this very unusual story about a manager of a person's business, of a person's property, who is accused of squandering it, and then when he believes that the boss, when he believes that the master is going to fire him, he is trying to figure out, okay, what am I going to do? What will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? What am I going to do? I am not prepared for what's coming. And so as he believes that he's about to be fired, he does something that probably kind of rubs us the wrong way, which is that he calls the persons who owe him money and says, look, you know this? You owe my master 100 jugs of olive oil. Make it 50. Okay? Now, by the way, let me put these numbers into some kind of perspective. These are big amounts. All right? This isn't a little bit. All right? 100 jugs of olive oil is about 600 gallons. Okay? So he's reducing the bill by 300 gallons of olive oil. And even at Costco prices, that is a lot of money. Okay? It's a lot. All right? 100 containers of wheat is 33 tons. Okay? So we're talking massive quantities that are owed to his master, massive amounts by which he's reducing the bill. Okay? We're talking big numbers. This isn't just a little bit. It's a lot of money. And what happens when the master finds out? Well, you expect that when the master finds out that he has done this, that he is going to tear him limb from limb. But instead, the master sees what he has done, and he says to him, you acted shrewdly. Good move. Good move. Look at how shrewd people are. The children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. This is smart. That word shrewd, by the way, it means to act with insight, to act with a deeper understanding of what's going on. And he's saying, you did a wonderful thing. Now, why is it wonderful? By the way, we're not really sure. There are no lawyers from that time who are alive to tell us exactly how contract law works in that time. So we're not really sure what the legal options are for the master in that circumstance, because this is his appointed representative who's doing it. And I know in modern terms we hear these phrases like, apparent authority and stuff like that to make this reduction. So we're not sure what the master can do, but we're pretty sure the master's got the option here of renouncing this reduction because it was unauthorized, and so that he could have done that, in which case he would have looked bad, all right? Or he lets this stand, at which point these debtors love him. And it seems that he is happy with looking generous. Look at this. This is he's amazingly generous now in the eyes of the people he does business with because he reduced their debts. I mean, imagine if your next credit card bill just came in and said, we like you. We cut it in half. Okay? I mean, you'd probably stay with that company for a while, right? Okay, you'd like it. Unless you're really smart and they're going to go out of business. But you would like them. And so he seems to be understanding one of the things that's really important, which is the value of relationships. What the dishonest manager did here is he's trading money for goodwill. And the master is understanding that is a good trade. To trade money for goodwill is a good trade. Okay. Now, some of you are bothered still by just the sheer dishonesty of this, right? Some of you are sitting here and saying, wait a second, but I'm bothered by the fact that this guy just went and reduced the debt on his own. All right? So some of you would be bothered by that as a principle. And I want to do a little digression here and talk to you for a second as a reminder about why we're given principles from God on how to behave. All right? Early on, when there's no real organized society and there's no courts and there's no police and stuff like that, people would just take vengeance on one another for perceived wrongdoings. right? Okay, so they would just, it was the Wild West, and people would just, I think you did this to me, so I'm going to do this to you. If you cheat me, I'm going to cheat you. You hurt me, I'm going to hurt you. And people thought that a deterrent was to do more than that. So it's like, you hurt my brother, I'm going to hurt two of your brothers, okay? And people did that. So actually, when we see in the Hebrew Scriptures an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that was actually an improvement. It was an improvement because it was no longer like, you 2 eyes for an eye. He's like, no, you're limited. You're limited. If somebody hurts you, you can only hurt them back as much as they hurt you. You can't go over. Because what would happen, it was a never-ending cycle, right? I mean, you hurt my brother, I'm going to hurt 2 of your brothers, so he hurts 3 more of yours, and it keeps going. It would keep getting worse. And so God was trying to say, no, I'm telling you, no. And God gave us principles that outlined how we are supposed to behave with one another, not because the principles are so important in and of themselves, but so that we would have rules by which we all understood that if we abide by the rules, we can get along. Okay? God prizes relationships. God prizes loving one another. And God was saying, you know what? Here are some principles. You want to get along? First, don't kill each other. No killing. No stealing. All right? No coveting. Don't do these things because those things wreck relationships. And what was prized was the relationship. God gave us the gift of principles so that relationships would be nurtured. All right? Apart from the nurturing of the relationship, it wasn't that the principle was important in and of itself. It was that the principle set down guidelines by which we would know how to get along. All right? It's kind of like what many groups do, right? You get together and you're a group and you sit down, okay, what are the ground rules for this group? And you're doing it not because you want to worship ground rules, but because ground rules prevent future conflict within the group. That's the idea of it. Parents do this, right? You have 2 kids. So you have 2 kids, let's say you have 2 kids, you buy a video game. And they're fighting over when they should play the video game, all right? So finally you sit there and you say, okay, Jimmy, you get to play from 4 till 5. Tommy, you get to play from 5 until 6. Okay? And that's the rule. And you're doing that just so they won't kill each other over the game. But it would be silly if Tommy turns 25, has his own apartment, buys a video game, you go over to his house and you say, hey, Tommy, show me the video game. And he says, not till 5. My mother always told me I can't play until 5 o'clock. The principle, the rule wasn't needed anymore. Because there was no longer a fractured relationship to worry about in that case, right? Okay? And so sometimes we need to understand that the principles of relationship, of ethical behavior are given to us so that we will have a common understanding of how to get along. That's the reason for them. Right? And so in this story, Jesus is saying, look, what's really important here is the relationship. Master understands that. What was important was not that he just unilaterally changed the bill, it was that he did this and nurtured relationships in the process. In fact, the relationship is so important that I've always kind of had a simple question about this passage when I read this, which is, when you're living in the New York metropolitan area and you hear this story and you hear that this guy reduced the bill from 100 jugs of oil to 50, I always wondered, why didn't he ask for a kickback? Wouldn't that have been simpler? I'll reduce it from 100 to 50, you give me 5. Okay? That's kind of the New York way of doing things, right? That's what I would have expected, because he's worried about how he's going to take care of himself in the future. But look at what he actually said. He said that people may welcome me into their homes. It wasn't just about how am I going to have enough money to buy food or a place to live. He was losing his place of belonging. He was losing his place to be. And more than just having the money with which to do things. Because these were vast sums of money that we're talking about. If he had taken a little piece of it, he would have had money to live on, money to invest, money to lend. But he didn't say, I've decided what to do so that when I'm dismissed, I'll have enough money to live on. He said, so that people may welcome me into their homes. He knew that what he needed for his future was a place to belong. In fact, when Jesus is talking about this passage after he's finished telling the story, he says, and I tell you, make friends for yourselves. Make friends for yourselves. Make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth. And what is dishonest wealth? You can put a ton of, it's not really clear in the language what it means. I mean, the words are just there that he says that the wealth is dishonest. And I'm not at all sure that this means anything about how the wealth was acquired. Okay? To me, the way I choose to read it, and you can interpret it, your own way, because it's just the words are plain without much explanation. I think the issue is that wealth itself is dishonest to the extent that people believe that it's promising something it can't deliver. Make friends for yourselves. Develop something which is truly valuable. Wealth tries to tell you that it is valuable. Wealth tries to tell you that it is what it is what you need. Wealth is dishonest. It can do certain things, but it can't do as much as people think it can do. But make friends for yourselves. Use the dishonest wealth to make friends for yourselves, so that you'll be welcome. Wealth is not what matters. Friends matter. So I think a really important lesson for us in terms of thinking about what will make us happy is to remember that relationships are your most important resource. I see lots of people who are very lonely, and they're not starving. Relationships are your most important resource. When things are tough, it's like we're talking about the kids in church school today. When things are tough, nothing is worse than being alone. Right? One of the things, I in my position, I have the opportunity to be with folks when they're in tough times in their life. And one of the most important questions that I ask is, how's your support system? What's your support system like? That when you're going through this really tough time in your life, what have you got in terms of friends? People you can confide in, people you can unload to, all right? Because I understand. I think we all kind of understand that that's the thing you need to get you through. You need to have that team around you that will support you, that you can talk to, that will remind you that you are good and loved and valuable. You need that in order to get through the hard times in your life. It is so important. And you need to put that first. It says, you've not been faithful with dishonest wealth. So what does it mean to be faithful? It means to take the resources you've been given and put it toward the most important things. Isn't that what faithful means? Faithful means to do the best, to do what's right with what you have. That's being faithful. You're faithful with your day when you take your time and you do the best you can. You do what God would have you do. You're faithful with your resources, your material resources, when you use them to do what's important, when you do what God would have you do with them. Right? Are you pursuing what's good? Because if you're not, you're actually following a different master. See, it's an interesting turn in this passage that Jesus starts with this story about a master who's about a manager who's doing things that you would regard as dishonest. all right, as bad. And by the end, he says, no, you see what's actually happening here? He's actually taking dishonest wealth, wealth that lies to you about its value, and is putting it toward what's important. And he's actually demonstrating that he understands that you can't serve God and wealth. And in fact, probably many of us learned this passage, and in a lot of translations, they leave that word untranslated. We've learned it as God and mammon. Okay, how many of you heard God and mammon somewhere along the way, right? Okay, all right. Mammon was the name of the Syrian god of wealth. And so when Jesus says it and says God and mammon, he's literally holding up the idea of two different gods. You're either serving your God or you're serving the god of wealth, the god of money. All right? And so in that sense, it might have been helpful, I think, had they not tried to translate that word, but simply left it as mammon, so that you would ask, what is mammon? And say, well, it's the Syrian god of money. Okay. But it would leave intact the understanding that it's about competing gods here. And you can only serve one. Can't serve multiple gods. So he's saying, look, you can't serve God and wealth. There can only be one priority in your life. And priorities shape our lives. We have Financial Peace University going on. And whenever it talks about budgeting, there's a couple things, right, that happen in your budgets. How many of you tried to put together a budget at some point for your household, right? Okay, most people do. And most people tell you this. When you're financially budgeting, what do? For a Christian, financially budgeting, the first thing in your budget is your tithe. The first thing in your budget is what you're giving to God. It's that tithe right off the top. Number two is your savings. You got to take that money for your future and put it aside right away. And then you have to live on the rest, right? I mean, that's what folks are advised to do. Very few people do this. All right. Very few people do this. Very few people take their budget and start with what they're going to give to God, then follow it with what they're going to save for their future, and then live on the rest. The vast majority of people start with number 3. They kind of go backwards. They do number 3, and if there's anything left out of number 3, it goes to number 2, and if there's anything left out of number 2, it goes to number 1. But I want you to think about this principle and apply it to what's more important than your financial future, your relationships. If you were going to do this with your relationships, what would that look like? What it would look like is this, that you would do relationship budgeting. And you would take your time. And you would say, first, how am I working on how am I using my time to develop my relationship with God? Devotionals. Joining a connect group where you're in a small group and talking about godly things with folks. All right. And then second, your personal relationships. Calling a friend, meeting for lunch, keeping those relationships alive, building up that support network that everybody needs in order to get through tough times. If you were going to do relationship budgeting, you would do the same thing. God first, your future second, and everything else third. If you're putting everything else first, you're making the same mistake in your relationship time budgeting as you are in financial budgeting. You have to set aside that time for God first, and then you have to set aside that time to develop your personal relationship second, and then everything else. And there's a little benefit if you do this, see. If you invest in your relationships, unlike savings is money you can't touch, right? So you save for your future and you sock it away and you put it in that, IRA or whatever, and you can't touch it. The beauty of the relationship piece is when you invest in your relationships, it not only makes you happier later, it makes you happier now. It's amazing how much better you'll feel if you just take the time to do that. Take the time to build up and strengthen your relationships. You don't want to get to that place in your life where you're lonely and you're thinking about good friends you once had and wondering, what happened? When did we stop talking to one another? And you won't actually kind of be able to put a finger on it because there wasn't probably, in most cases, not a cause. You just, you had a lunch scheduled and you canceled it and you never rescheduled it. And then that lunch never happened, and it maybe became a phone call once in a while, and maybe that phone call became a Christmas card. And maybe after a while the cards stopped. And a friendship that was once really valuable, and a friendship that you could really use at that point in your life, isn't there. Invest in your relationships. You'll be happier now, and you'll be happier later. It's one of the most important things that we can do, is to take everything that we're given and put it in that right order. God first, our future second, and then everything else. Don't let the everything else run your life. In fact, next week we're going to be talking about what it means to live a life that is centered and focused around the future, looking back at the present rather than from the present looking forward, as we go on with week 3 of How to Be Happy.